Hi everyone, so this is the beginning video of those that have decided to start walking in faith. Maybe my video has prompted you to, just surrender your will to God. Maybe you've watched all my videos and, you realize that, you shouldn't be following what the world says, but you should be following God. Your dependence shouldn't be in your job, in your bank account, or anything else other than God, because who knows if it's taken away, you know, who knows if it's going to be taken away. And if it's going to be taken away, you're either going to be dismayed or you're going to, fully trust God. So I hope it's the latter. So I really want to start off the videos with this one because I believe hearing God is of absolute importance, because if I didn't hear God, then I would have never got where I was at. The situations that I've encountered that, would really shake faith, would have probably moved me off the path. The desperation of the circumstances would have led me into taking care of issues by myself and through my strength instead of relying on God. So basically, when I surrendered my will, I'm not the one who made the choices anymore. It was God who made the choices for me. It was God who led me into action and doing what I needed to do. So I always, journaled. I just wrote down what God told me, and it was like taking dictation off a blackboard. And so it was by faith that I did what God wanted me to do. If He told me to wait, I would wait. If He told me to start packing, like He did with one example of an apartment, I started packing months before by God's instructions. And so that's where faith began for the apartment. And so all these different circumstances came up to try to move me off of faith, but I held on to it according to Hebrews 11:1. And, to make a long story short, there were a lot of things that came against the faith, but also God gave me confirmations that the path that I was walking on was what He wanted. And He had, amazingly provided for that apartment. So God is going to give you, hard circumstances to try to move you off of faith, because it's going to be pressure against your flesh. But you must resist it through faith, letting God lead you. You will also have people coming against your faith walk because you're walking in a way that they cannot understand. If you are totally relying on God, they will come against you through the Adamic mindset, through independence from God, and tell you that you need to take care of it, yourself. But honestly, I think it honestly depends on your jar. If you're a nice looking jar, people will be accepting of it. If you're not a nice looking jar, then unfortunately that's, apparently the way the church works. But of course the world is going to come against you because they don't understand. But it's pretty sad when fellow believers come against your faith walk, because they're operating out of independence still, and they don't have a clue of what faith is. So the title of this video is Hearing God. And, I was thinking about this one day, about how, I do have a few videos, on tips on hearing God and stuff, but I really wanted to give an intro video of, hearing God, the first steps in doing such. And, I've been hearing God ever since like 2002. And I never knew I could hear God before. I mean, I heard Him here and there. Like one time there, I was reading the Word, and I happened to look up, and there was a man laying on the ground. And I heard Him say, "Go up and go out to him." So I got my Bible and went out to the guy. And the guy was telling me how he was evicted from his place, and he drank a whole gallon of whiskey, and he was laying out in the sun. So I gave him, through scripture, some things that would apply to his situation. And he got on his knees and he was saying, God, help me, please. So I brought him in. I let him take a shower in my place, gave him something to eat, and then he went on his way to detox. Came back a few days later and gave me a book of Psalms and some other book. So, through that, it must have been like a few years later, I happened to see this man working in a hotel, and he had a cross around his neck, and it was evident. So it made me, feel good that one act of obedience, possibly saved this man. So I was happy, just to see that. So obedience is very important. Hearing God is very important. Through the flesh, you may not be comfortable in obeying God, but it's so very important. And so I'm going to, get started with this. Now, if you tell someone of the world you're hearing God, you'll be labeled crazy. And you're going to find that out for yourself. I mean, maybe there's a lot of people in church who you would tell that to, and they would look at you like you're nuts. You tell people of the world, they're going to look at you like you're nuts. But you know who you can talk to in the body, because those who do the same will, confirm that that's important. Because, through God, we can hear instructions. He can comfort us, He can guide us. But a lot of people would tend not to hear God because maybe they don't know how. Maybe they think it's absolutely crazy. So they won't bother. Now, I want to give some biblical examples of people who have heard from God and were obedient to what God had said. And first is Abraham. God told him to go to the land that He would show him. And through God, God said to him, he will have a son in his old age. And that was a very thing that was, that was a stretch of faith, most likely for him. Because here he was old, his wife was old, and they were beyond the age of having kids. And so he believed what God had said. But through the years, I think, the pressure of circumstances and, time really weighs on faith. And so his wife apparently got sick of waiting. She brought Hagar to him, and he thought, through the flesh that that's maybe what God was talking about. So through Hagar, he had a son, Ishmael. And if anything, that was a lack of faith. God told me, do not let this desperation of the circumstances make your decision. So there was a war waged between the children of Israel and the children of Ishmael since. So through Abraham, he heard from God that, a nation would come through him. So he reasoned after Ishmael, probably before too, that, God was going to give him what he desired. But it may have sparked faith in him, and this is a revelation. It may have sparked, faith in Abraham, knowing that, Hagar had a son through him. So he was like, oh, maybe this is true. Because before, he was old and stuff, but now, God, worked everything out to where he had a son. So maybe he thought to himself, I can have kids. So he maybe this circumstance, even though he possibly lacked faith, maybe this circumstance had opened his eyes to the fact that what God was saying was true, and that He was bringing life back not only to him, but to Sarah. So the next person I want to speak about is Elijah. God told him that there would be a famine, and to go before Ahab and tell him that. Now this would be a stretch of faith because, a famine hasn't hit yet. Maybe it rained. So he went to, God, not God, but King Ahab by faith and said that there's not going to be a famine. There's going to be a famine. And so he got to Ahab, told him that, and then God told him to go by a brook and he would provide the ravens, meat and bread for him. That's a stretch of faith. I mean, to rely on an animal to bring you something, but he stood by faith and God brought, ravens and he had, food to eat. And so he drank by the brook. But since the famine had started, the brook dried up. So that would be a stretch of faith. How am I going to drink? How am I going to survive? Well, God spoke up. He said, I am going to send you to a widow in Zarephath, and I will provide for you there. So, looking at the circumstance through culture today, this man would be criticized for depending on somebody, for a widow to take care of him. Well, if this happened today, people would talk with the widow and say, why are you letting this freeloader in there? Tell him to move. And so I don't know if this happened at that time, but I know it would happen today. Depending on the jar. I mean, there's a lot of people in the church who, if they know Elijah and know about his ministry, they would be accepting of him. But if they don't know, they're going to judge him by the surface and, say that he's a freeloader and stuff like that. So he went to the widow, and she had the last bit of food left, and that would be also, something that would cause criticism toward Elijah for using the rest of the food that she had for him instead of her and her son. And that would be, a subject of controversy among the church and the world. So he heard from God to go to a brook. He heard from God to go to a widow, and God had provided. And you can read them for yourself in the book of Genesis and the book of, I think it's 1 Kings. Now, the subject of Elisha, I believe some of the things that I wrote down are from Elisha, or it could be Elijah. But either case, the point is hearing from God. So there was a time where the water that men of Israel were drinking, I think it was the prophets of God, and what they were drinking, or the stew that they were eating, was poisonous because of maybe something that was put in there. So he gave them instructions on what to put in there, and the poison was gone. So he heard from God on that, and that could be a stretch, hearing God in a situation like that, because you don't know if what you're hearing is correct. Another time, there was an axe head that fell off the axe into the water. There was no way to retrieve it. So he gave them instructions to throw a stick onto the water. Once they did that, the axe head came up to the top, which is an unbelievable circumstance. But hearing God, really showed, the truth. He told Naaman the Syrian to wash in the Jordan 7 times. And here, was, a warrior, a leader, and something that was said to him could be offensive, and he took offense in it until he, his servant, reasoned with him that, this prophet gave you instructions on what to do. And so, he heard for God for Naaman, which could have been a stretch to, say that to a leader of somebody. And then we have Jesus. Jesus predicted his death to his disciples. He told Nathanael he saw him by the tree. And he told Peter he would deny him 3 times. So those are examples of hearing God. Now, you can hear God for yourself. Maybe you've never done it before. And you maybe through my videos, and hear how I heard God. Maybe that's prompted you to hear Him for yourself, and maybe you're coming to my videos for the first time, and you realize that you need to start walking in faith. You need to be guided by God. And so Jesus said that my sheep hear my voice, so you can hear God for yourself. But there's a lot of people that don't teach that. If it wasn't for me going to the church that I did and them having a prophetic class to where, they taught you to hear God, then I would have never done it. I would have still heard God sporadically. But, it's very important that if you're starting a faith walk, then you need to hear God. You need to grasp onto Him more than to what you see with your own eyes, what you see with your fleshly eyes. Because if you're walking in the flesh, you're never going to walk in faith. So I want to give you some tips, into hearing God's voice, stuff that I do, maybe that you would want to adopt yourself in order to be able to do this. So what I usually do is I get a pen and paper, and I would just start writing. But I would suggest for you to get a pen and paper, write a question down, and ask God, Lord, what do you want to say? Or how about this subject? And then just sit and wait. And sometimes it's going to be you having to fight, stuff that, you have to do. And that's a way of dealing with your flesh in that circumstance. So write a question and wait. And a good example of dealing with the flesh was the disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus told them to, pray with Him, but they fell asleep. So their flesh had to be dealt with. So it's important, to get a pen and paper, and write down what God is saying, to start learning to do that. It may be one or two words, but those words can be powerful. He may give you stuff about the future. He may give you, words of encouragement, and that's good. Now, when you hear His voice, I personally hear my own voice in my head. And, a lot of people have said that. That's what they hear. So I would suggest, to follow that. I mean, some people can hear God audibly. But, you may hear your own voice in your head, so take that down. But you would need to differentiate between three. Your flesh, where you're hearing yourself, your desires, your wants. You could hear the enemy. And then it could be God's voice. So how would you know if it's God? Well, He speaks of comfort. He speaks of things to come and stuff like that. The enemy, when he speaks, it usually comes up in times that are stressful, in time, dealing with rejection, dealing with, the hate from other people. So that's how you would know it's the enemy. If it's your flesh, well, you're not going to know if it's between your flesh and God. You're not going to know the difference. I would say it's time. Let time pass. And if it's from God, then what will happen will be true. If it's not from God, then you're going to know it. So like I said at the beginning, when I heard God, it was one or two words, but then more words started coming. So I kept a journal, and then I would type up my journal into my computer. That way I had a record of, what God was saying. So then I would hit the control button and F to find, that exact circumstance, to find exactly what God had said through that time, so that I could see what words were fulfilled. So, you could practice, refining, what you're hearing, God's voice. So you can, if you're sitting in the car one day and you can ask, I mean, if you're in front of a building or something, Or you may be, just looking straight ahead, and you can, try to hear, from God, what color car is going to pass by? And you can try to hear God's voice that way. Another time is when you're put into the circumstance of having to give somebody a prophetic word. I was taught that if you pray for somebody, that can lead into the prophetic. So when you're put into the position of praying for someone, that prayer itself can be prophetic, and it can move you into hearing God's voice. And just to tie into the journal, what I used to do is I would write a prayer at the beginning. And that was sort of like, bridging the gap into hearing God's voice. So it led right off into the prophetic, in which I heard from God. So you could do the same thing, write a prayer out to God and, you know, start writing his words down. So, pray for somebody and, see if that moves into the prophetic, because it's not you praying, it's the Holy Spirit when you're put into that position and praying for somebody. It's an awkward position, but you're letting the Holy Spirit take over. And since he's taken over, it's going to move into the prophetic. You're going to speak things into people's lives. You're going to confirm what's going on in their life without having any knowledge of it. So when writing down the words of, what you're hearing, you could be either right or wrong. You not necessarily wrong. You could be speaking on something for somebody, and it could happen later down the road. So don't dismiss it as if you didn't hear from God. It could be something that is meant for later. Now, you can ask God questions, in your journal, and wait and hear his responses. So what is the goal of all of this? The goal in hearing God is to, listen for sentences. Maybe you're writing a few words down, stretch it out, wait, deal with the flesh. If there's anything that's got to be done, just push it to the side unless it's really pressing, you know, and, deal with it. But the thing is, there will always be something that will try to take you away from listening to God. So you got to really know what's a priority and what is not spiritually. So, just wait for more and write more down so that you can get into the habit of hearing God totally and being guided by him. And the whole purpose is putting down the flesh, not following the circumstances, not following what you want to do, but following God wholeheartedly. Now, the next importance in hearing God is when you are hearing him and you're writing down his instructions, is that you got to be obedient. You got to do what he's saying to the letter and not let circumstances move you off that. Because that's what made Abraham, really special, is the fact that he was obedient to God. He believed what God had said. And, following faith, it may sound crazy, but, that means if it sounds crazy, that means that you're interpreting it through the flesh and not the spirit. Anything that is done in the spirit realm is going to be crazy to the flesh and to the logical mind. So I want to give some examples. There was a story I heard, or a testimony, about these teachers that were gathered around this girl that was being sent out as a missionary. And you can hear this for yourself. Look for on YouTube the video Strong Fire Burn. And, it gives things that would move you into, a deeper walk with God. And you're going to hear this testimony on there. But this girl was sent out as a missionary. And this prophetic teacher, Graham Cook, heard from God, I hate mommies and daddies. And so when we hear something like that, through the flesh, we're going to think it's crazy. But it was pressed on him to say it. So he said to her, the Lord wants you to know that he hates mommies and daddies. And she looked at him, and she went into a fit and a rage, and they prayed for her, and she became settled. Come to find out that her family abused her, and the game that they used to play was called Mommies and Daddies. So that goes to prove that when you hear from God, it may sound crazy according to the logical mind, but through faith, is something that is needed. It's something that we need to do through faith because it's being obedient to God. And God wants to deal with our flesh and our logical mind and start walking in faith and to walk in the Spirit. And another time I heard of this prophetic teacher. He was I believe, in church, and he heard from God say macaroni and cheese. And, that sounds absolutely ludicrous according to the logical mind. But he said it. And after he said it, the person, stood up, and come to find out, I believe, was that they were going to commit suicide, and they came to church looking to see if God was really real. So as you can see through those two examples, it's important in hearing God, because God can give us instructions, for different circumstances. So I believe I'm at the conclusion of it, and I pray that, this will spark, your own faith walk. And this is just the beginning videos that I'm going to create. And, we're in this together. We're both walking in faith. And, so many times I walked in faith, for my first book. And I had waited like a decade for the book to be published. And I can't tell you how the circumstances weigh on your faith. Time can really put pressure on. And, the people that are critical around you can look at you like, it's not going to happen. I knew you were full of it. Until, it does happen, and then they can see. So, if you haven't already, if you're new to my videos and you haven't seen my book, check out Who Is Your Provider. It's on Amazon.com. It's on BarnesandNoble.com. And you can also get it on eBay. So the whole purpose of it is to make people aware of what God can do. It's to move them off their logical mind and to walk in faith. It's to expose the world's thinking for what it is, and for people to see that they can trust God. So I pray that this is sparking you to walk in your, faith on your own. I would just encourage you not to, listen to people, not to listen to your logical mind, because that will move you off of faith. And faith is the most absolute importance in your Christian walk. And, Hebrews 11:1 says, let me think about it. It says, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. So I would suggest, meditate on that verse to see what it says and how it can be applied to your own life. And, go out, get a pad of paper, get a pen, write God a question, and see what he says. And, just follow the tips that I've given you. There's really no said way of doing it. Do whatever feels comfortable. But the whole purpose is hearing God and not yourself. So stay tuned. I'm going to be sending more videos your way.